did mention that, like, rigging, sometimes I use it for, like, normally you use it to animate a character, but a lot of times I will use it to just, like, pose a model that I've made. And rigging, just, like, as a really brief overview, is basically adding bones or, like, a skeletal structure to your character, so that you have things to control the way it bends. And I'm just gonna kind of jump in and, like, show you guys how to start rigging, and it'll hopefully become, like, maybe obvious, like, why this would be beneficial. So one of the reasons I like it a lot is, like, I have tried before to make a, like, posed character where I just, like, model the whole thing freeform in pose, and, like, one arm was, like, a straight up foot longer than the other one. And after that, I'm like, wow, that was embarrassing. I do like symmetry, and if I model it, you know, in T-pose or A-pose with symmetry on, the arms are going to be the exact same length, and then I can just bend it into whatever position I need. So that's usually what I do now. I'll just model it with symmetry. I only need to model it once because I'm only modeling half of it, and just everything is, like, definitely going to be the right height, makes everything easier. The first thing you're going to need is a mesh, in this case, we have this god-awful thing that I've created. And rigging is found, so again, if you go out of the modeling map tab into the rigging tab up here, you're going to see all these random options for things. So the first one you're going to want to look for is skeleton. And just do create joints. The only setting that I really pay attention to here is, like, sometimes the bone radius is, like, really big. Like, if I add this in, like, these bones, having circles this big is, like, to me, incredibly distracting. So sometimes I will just set the, I'll just, again, set this to something more like maybe 0.2 for short bone radius or something. And you can see that now they're a little bit more manageably sized for my character here. Again, not entirely important. So, by default, it's going to put things flat on it's going to create your joints, like, flat on a plane. So if I do create joints, and I just sort of click around, it's going to dump those pretty much directly on my ground plane. If you're working one of the orthographic modes, it's going to put it straight up and down on that orthographic plane, so like this. Haha, and then you just have, like, straight segments of joints. So depending on what kind of joints you're putting in, it, you know, varies a little bit which axis you're going to want to put them in on. But just, like, as a really quick intro to, like, I guess how these work. So you'll notice that once I made the joints, it's added this little box in the outliner for the joint. If I expand that forever, you can see that it lists all of my joints out here. Apparently I made 7 of them. So if I move joint 1, it's going to take all of the rest of the joints with it. If I move joint 5, it's going to take joint 6 and 7 with it. So these basically work off of parenting. So if I took joint 3 and just middle mouse button drag that somewhere out of the chain, you can see that it's actually disconnected it from bone 2. If I move bone 1 now, it's only going to shift that joint 2 with it. Because, again, joint 3 is no longer attached to it in the chain. If I took joint 3 and again, just middle mouse button dragging, I'm just going to drop it on top of joint 1. So you'll notice that now, instead of having a thing where it's like joint 1, 2, and then, like, 3 is nested under 2, it's joint 3 is sitting at the same level as joint 2. If I do this, you can see it's connected them a little bit differently. Instead of having a line going like this, they're both attached directly to joint 1. So I rotate that, and you can see that now I have separate control of, like, joint 2 versus joint 3, etc. So this just sort of, like, makes sense, like, as a concept of, like, how these work with each other and move. Cool. All right, so again, these work with parenting, so I'm just going to kind of like that. If you do ever need to, like, expand your entire hierarchy of something in your outliner, just hold down Shift and click on that plus button. It'll expand the whole thing, which sometimes in rigging can get ridiculous, but whatever. So in this case, like, the rig doesn't really do a whole heck of a lot there. So I'm gonna show you guys, like, I guess, how to add in, you know, useful joints into your piece. Wow, that head is just upsetting. All of this is upsetting. Anyway, so normally if you're doing, I'm just gonna show you, like, a human rig. I'll probably end up doing, like, mostly just the legs for today or something like that, but I'll show you guys how to set up like the default human rig. And if you guys want to copy down the outliner structure, I have a video of it on the YouTube that you can reference, but this is like pretty common to use for rigs. So I'm just going to make a joint. I'm going to put it somewhere like in the sort of center of the pelvis, and I'm going to call this my root joint. I'm going to duplicate that twice. So right now what I have is 3 joints sitting directly on top of each other. I'm going to call one of the duplicates spine 1 and the other one pelvis. And I'm basically just going to take both of these and middle mouse button drag them under my root. So now I have a root with 2 little joints underneath it. So if I move the root somewhere, it's going to take spine 1 and pelvis with it. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of like why you do that right now, because that's more of like rigging thing. I just kind of want to show you how to like set up joints on your bones pretty much. So at this point, I think I'll start with the leg, because it's like the least awful part of this model. And I'm just going to make another skeleton. So just skeleton, create joints. And I'm going to throw in a joint kind of at the hip, at the knee, like around that center loop in the knee. And I'll usually do it a little bit forward in the ankle, and I'll usually just put one in the ball of the foot. And those are my leg joints. So you can see if I click on that, it kind of resembles like a leg if you look at it. The next thing you always have to do when you're doing leg stuff is, it pretty much made it like in the center of the body where like the only place there is no legs in this area is where it's put the joint. So I'm just going to grab that whole thing and just be like, huzzah, you're actually in the leg now. And then it's usually a good idea, especially if you have like any reasonable number of joints, to actually go through and like label them. So in this case, I'm just going to say left hip. And how you label left and right, I don't really care. I personally go based off character space, so like the character's left is what I call left. Knee, ankle, all right, and ball. All right, so once I have that, so you can see like if I go through and I rotate this up, he's like kicking very aggressively, and you can like bend him around, and it kind of behaves like a leg. But this isn't right now attached into my skeleton at all, so what I'm going to do is just take left hip and middle mouse button drag it under pelvis. And you can see hopefully that it's added that weird, or like this extra little joint here. So now if I take my pelvis, I can move it back and forth. It's going to take my hip with it. All right. So what I'm going to do is just show you guys really quickly, if you guys ever need to duplicate your joint chain, say you're making something like symmetrical like this, and you, rather than having to like manually duplicate this and like hope it gets back into the right spot, there is a way where you can like duplicate and automatically rename joints in Maya, and it's beautiful. So I'm just going to, again, select the left hip joint. If I go up to skeleton, mirror joints, and definitely open the tool settings for this one. So usually I just leave this on behavior, I think. And mirror across, I honestly usually just click one until like that's not what I wanted. I'll usually just click one until it does what I want. In this case, apparently I wanted the YZ axis. But the thing that makes this really, really powerful is you can search for a particular string, so like a series of characters, and replace it with whatever. So basically like the equivalent of find and replace in Microsoft Word. So if I search for capital L underscore and replace it with capital R underscore, just signifying right, and I hit apply, you can see that not only has it mirrored the joints in my legs, but it's also renamed them for the right side of the leg. So you totally don't need to go through and like rename 80 bajillion things. So again, if you need that tool, it's just skeleton mirror joints. And it's the best thing ever. So that's more or less how you make like leg joints. I'm just gonna throw in like a really, really crappy joint chain. Actually, no, I'm gonna bust in really quick because we're running out of time. All right, so if I wanted to actually, like right now we have these joints and it's all fine and dandy, but they're not really controlling the mesh. So if you do actually want the mesh to deform with the joints, select said mesh, select, I usually use the, just select the whole root. And then you're going to go to skin, which is right to the right of skeleton. So skin and then bind skin. There's a few different options here. I mean, these I pretty much just fiddle with until they do what I want. It's mostly this top one that I pay attention to. So bind to joint hierarchy is going to be, if you've selected like one bone, so in this case like root, it's going to also attach the skin to spine, pelvis, knees, like all of the stuff that's attached to that root. If you do selected joints and I only have root selected, it's going to bind the entire skeleton just to the root. Object hierarchy, honestly, I don't know what it does. I've never had to use it. Because I think it's some like other weird, I don't know. So in this case, I do want joint hierarchy. I want the skin to be attached to all the leg joints, so I'm going to select that. And basically what binding a skin does is it assigns, they call it a weight, but it's pretty much like, it's gonna allow the rig to drag the vertices around on your mesh and deform them. And each vertex is attached by a certain percentage, basically, to each joint, if that makes sense. So the higher your max influence is, the more joints are going to affect a given vertex. Usually, I'll just leave it at 3. I feel like that's kind of reasonable. And then I'm just going to hit apply. So you can see now, and this is why I really like using display layers. So for one, like I don't really want to be selecting my mesh right now. It's kind of annoying, so I'm going to select that. Just make a new display layer for it. Call it skin. And I'll just set this to reference so I don't need to keep clicking on it accidentally. The other thing I'm going to do, if you ever like want to see your rig, if you right up here, just like right above your viewport, in your little viewport menus, if you do shading and just turn on X-ray joints, it'll actually show you your joints through your mesh, which I just think makes life a lot easier for stuff. But you can see now that if I move the leg, it's actually taken the mesh with it. Not necessarily in a desirable way, but it is correctly moving the mesh. The nicer your topology is, the nicer your joint, like the default weights that Maya does are going to be for the most part. So just like a few quick like housekeeping things with joints. So they work based on translation. So like if you shift this around, it's changing its position, but it's also changing the length of the joint itself. The length of the joint is basically calculated by the distance from point A to point B. So once you set the original, like whatever position of the joints that you're happy with, you shouldn't really play around with the translation, because again, it is going to actually change the length of the joint itself. Especially like once you bind it, you usually don't play with translation. And then so having rotation on your joints is usually like horrible practice because it'll break all manner of fun things. So a lot of time, and I'm not really going to focus on it so much today, but you can set up what's called controls, which are basically just like little NURBS curves or pieces of geometry, like whatever you prefer, that you end up like constraining to these joints. And you like don't select the joints when you're animating at all. You just modify the controls, and it makes things a little bit easier to not screw up. In the case of just posing a model, sometimes I do shamelessly just be like, I'm just going to move all my joints around, what the heck, who cares? Never animate on your joints if you need to do like an actual animation. I had a kid do it once for my anim class, and he's like, this is horrible, like this is so hard, and I think everything's broken. And I'm like, you animate on your joints? And he's like, yeah. And I'm like, you don't do that. But anyway, so again, normally you'd set up controls for like proper animation, but not a proper animation class, so who cares? So in this case, I'm just going to show you how to do some really quickie like controls on this. So you can see like right now, if I move the character's left leg up, it's pulling his legs apart in a very pleasing fashion. So what I'm going to do is, first of all, make another layer for these joints because they annoy the crap out of me. If you ever try to marquee select anything with joints in here, like it'll it defaults to only selecting the joints, which drives me absolutely nuts. So in this case, what you're going to want to do is called weight painting. So if I select my mesh, right-click, and do Paint Skin Weights tool, it's going to pull up this glorious menu here. Basically, it shows you a visual representation of how all of the joints are affecting specific pieces of your mesh. So before I get into what all this stuff is, usually what I like to do is turn on Use Color Ramp. I just find this to be easier visually to look at than a grayscale thing. So like white is going to be 100% influence, and then as it fades to blue, it gets to less and less influence. And that's, again, usually like the first thing I'll do. So here you can see basically a list of all of the different joints that is attached to your skin. So if you click on them, again, you can see it's sort of like toggling through different displays of little gradients or like little weights. So basically what I want to do, so if you look at like this particular part of the leg here, it makes sense that like, you know, if you move your knee, the skin of your lower leg is going to follow that knee. So I would expect this to be either super red for a lot of influence or like white for total influence. But right now you can see like down here, it's fading a little bit to yellow. And it looks like if I click on right knee, so you can see that it has, for some reason, like moderate to high influence on my left leg. A lot of times this happens just like on legs or like things that are really close to each other, because it's just like the computer doesn't differentiate. It doesn't know that it's a separate leg. It's like, oh, this is kind of close to that joint, so I'm gonna weight it on that joint. So easiest way to fix that is I'm just on my right knee. You can, if you go down here, kind of in the middle of the little tool settings thing, you'll see these different options for replace, scale, smooth, add, etc. Usually I use replace or smooth. And then you have some different brush settings. So this one is basically, like if you're in Photoshop, it's going to be a hard brush, no fall off. This one is like a very soft brush with a lot of fall off. Whichever one, use whichever works for you, doesn't really matter. So in this case, I want no influence of the right knee on my left leg, because that's stupid. So I'm just going to go to replace and turn on hard brush and set my value to 0. So opacity is pretty much what it says, it's opacity. Value is basically the influence, total influence on that joint. So value of 1 is going to be like complete influence. You can see that's dragging that back towards my right leg. A value of 0 is going to be no influence, which in this case is what I want. So if I just paint that on, you can see that my left knee is no longer going frantically towards my right leg. So you basically just like go through and sort of like paint your mesh until it's doing deforming in a way that you find pleasing or reasonable for whatever you happen to be working on. Are there any questions about just like, this is like a super brief like how to fiddle with rigs, but like are there any questions on whatever I just showed you? All right. And then sometimes you just, it's like impossible to like hit a specific vert, which is annoying. But basically, again, you would just sort of go through and do that. Like you could use this to define some of the like curvature of the back of the legs a little bit. So in this case, I'll set the value up to maybe 1 and then the opacity down a little bit. And if I paint on the bottom of the leg, you can see that it's sort of making a much tighter curve on the back of the leg because these joints here, or like these vertices here, are following the knee more closely and they're not deforming down as much when you bend the lower leg, if that makes sense. But again, like this is really great for, like if where did I put my rig? So just like, you know, power of rigging, like I can model this character flat and then just be like, now they do the can-can, I don't know. But you can pose them however you want, so it's really good. Like if you were doing something for, you know, a client or whatever, and they wanted the same character in multiple poses for some reason, maybe for like tabletop miniatures or something like that, you can pose them super, super easily with just a little bit of back-end work, and it makes everything a lot more reusable in the future. Again, it allows you to model with symmetry. It's good stuff. So that's pretty much rigging. Anyone have any questions about anything we've gone over in class today? Assignments, etc. All right, in that case, you have like 3 minutes left, be free.